know if people got that. I don't know like what's going on with like why I've seen so many people streaming on Twitter now, but
I
it's
wonder if
actually
it's
pretty
one of
interesting.
the paid things you can do
I
if
think
you're
so. Like I
verified or
assume.
something.
Yeah. Like I know it's they have to be like monetizing on it in some way because otherwise it's not even worth it. Also, hello chat. So glad to have you here with us today. We're just giving everyone a second to pour in, and then we will formally begin the conversation. Also, yet again, we're dressed opposites. Here in Texas, it's super warm today. So I'm out here in the sleeveless again. Darryl has at least two layers on, I see.
I do, yeah. It's yeah, opposite temperature.
Yeah, it's
Although
been
it's not
cold
too bad.
for yeah.
It's not too bad at the moment, actually. I was debating whether I have a t-shirt on because our heating's actually kicked in. But I've decided to go jumper just in case during the show I get super cold.
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. I have like this ring light on me, so usually it makes me hot enough. Um, Sometimes I get so hot, like, because I have the hottest room in the house. And sometimes I get so hot while recording, like, the first thing I do after I stream is I immediately have to go take a cold shower. Just, I hate Texas, bro. I hate being here. This is miserable. Okay. Also, chat, how do we sound audio wise? Just want to make sure that everything's level.
Are we comparable?
Yeah. Shouldn't be too big of a problem because I'll be recording this on Riverside. Actually, let me go ahead and just hit that record button now. But it won't be too big of an issue because um I'll be recording this on Riverside and I'll be able to play with the audio in post anyways after. So it's not a huge deal. Sound crisp? Amazing. That's what I want to hear. Let me just play with this window cropping for a little bit. Make sure that these are nice and even and display our names. Even though I'm gonna redo this anyway for the official upload of this. Okay. I think everything is in order. Wow, is that 107 people already? God, that's incredible.
Let's go.
Actually, I don't even think that's like slightly off because if you count it, if you add it up across both platforms, it's like 110. Okay, well, that's still pretty damn good. All right. I'm excited to do this. Um, it's been a while, I think, since we did our last one. When was the last time we did one?
Yeah, actually, I can't remember because we were doing some of the our
Terminally
extracurricular
online.
streams. Yeah.
Yeah. And then, oh wait, I think the last one we did, like in terms of like a live stream, was actually the one with Clark and Jacob. I think that was actually the one.
It feels like that was that this year or was that last year?
I think that was last year. Was it? Actually, I don't know. That might have been like it was either super early this year or late last year, I think. I think. I don't know.
Are you referencing it now? Are you trying to check?
Yeah. But it's been long enough. But part of it has just been there just hasn't been news, like especially not good news. Man, I want the next one that we have to be like we're having like a good time and we're talking about like, oh my god, the Final Fantasy 17 trailer was like the best. And this is
I
everything is so good right now, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, there's plenty of people that are happy with the current state of affairs, Ryan. You know.
Yeah, yeah, unfortunately. I think the people that are kind of doomer and they want bad things to happen to Square Enix to um, kind of like push maybe their personal vendetta against them is kind of a good time for them. At the same time, I do kind of look at this situation and I do think Square would not be in this situation if Square did not get themselves into this situation. So, um, I mean, it is in a lot of ways of their own volition. Um, it's years of management making, let's just say, certain choices, and I mean, here we are, right? So,
Here we are indeed.
okay, so let's go ahead and formally begin the stream. Hello, everyone. I'm the Night Sky Prince. I've been making YouTube content now for, I think, 9 years, focused on Final Fantasy. And today I am joined by my fellow Final Fantasy creator, Darryl from Final Fantasy Union. We have collaborated quite a few times now. However, I think that the current occasion really calls for another collaboration for a few reasons. The first is that Darryl is extremely good just with numbers in general. He's been tracking this company and everything they do. And secondly, he's probably the most knowledgeable person on Square Enix as a company that I know, period. There's just, there's like nobody else that I know that has put in the just sheer number of hours of research that you have. So Darryl, for anyone who some chance does not know who you are, I think they know you more than they know me at this point, even though this is going up on my channel. um, Tell us a little bit about Final Fantasy Union and Datalog, which is also your new project, and what you do.
Well, thank you for the introduction to start off with. So yeah, my name is Darryl. I run Final Fantasy Union and also a new channel called Datalog, as Ryan has mentioned there. And yeah, I've been doing YouTube content creation for almost a decade now, which is quite crazy to think about.
Mhm.
And yeah, like our whole objective around it is to try and, I guess, cut through the noise, talk about why people enjoy the franchise, try not to make people feel bad about what they enjoy about the franchise. But sometimes, there is situations, or situations do occur when there needs to be a reasoned voice as to what's going on. And obviously, we did that recently with a big video about the history of Square Enix, as some people are calling it. I call it the current state of Square Enix. There's a big comment chain as to whether or not it should have been called something else. But like, part of my thing is about context. I want everyone to make sure that when we are talking about things, that we understand why we're talking about them. Because as you said, Ryan, it's really easy to jump to the conclusion and try and figure out, like, okay, what's going on right now? But if you don't understand why it's happening, then I think it frames it in a very different way. So that's what I try and do with all the content I try and create, to make sure that everything is as explained as possible. Everything is very clear. And on the new channel as well, which is focused on other JRPG franchises, we're basically chronicling the JRPG genre, starting all over. Actually, we start with Hyderlight, but it's kind of a bonus video. And our first official one was Dragon Quest, but really focusing on the history, why these games were made in the first place, how these companies were formed, how the creators that we've come to know and love got their grounding and footing in the franchises they on in the industry, and where they went on to. And I think it's fascinating to see, like, all these different journeys. And I've honestly found it really inspiring, some of the journeys that these creators have taken. Like, the guy who made Falcom was like a mechanic, and was just like, you know what, I don't want to do this anymore. I want to make video games. And so he set up like a shop where he sold video games, and then just got people to come in, and they decided, let's make a game together. Let's go for it. And it's like,
That's incredible.
those things are so cool. And
Yeah,
I love finding those things out and then sharing them with everyone.
yeah, that's incredible. I didn't know that about Falcom. They're such an interesting company in general, I feel. The way they output is just completely crazy, man. Like, I mean, every year they have games coming out, and there's just a cadence that most companies in this modern era are not able to output at nearly the same level of frequency as them. And also with really managed budgets too. They're really cool. Tangent that I'm going on just because I just recently got into trails myself, and so I'm just
You're
really
getting quite the
fascinated by
fandom
it.
from what I hear.
Yeah. A lot of people were showing up to the streams. It was incredible. I've been kind of my back's been hurting, and I had some other problems sitting for a long period of time. But yeah, I'm getting back to playing the game, and it's just been incredible. And they already have the second chapter of Trails in the Sky like coming out next year, so it feels really like a great time to be getting into that series as a new fan. So one of the things that you mentioned is that you did a video on the state of Square Enix, and that was a really good video. I feel like I learned a lot about the company, and I've seen so many positive comments on social media about the video too, and how much they learned and how it really contextualizes the current state that Square Enix is in. I imagine that video, I mean, like most of your videos, really must have taken a lot of research. Was there any like big or surprising takeaway that you had from doing that video on the current state of Square Enix?
I think like a lot of my research is really focused around like Final Fantasy primarily and
Mm,
Square. I wasn't like massively familiar with the Enix side of the business, and really diving into the differences between Square and Enix before the merger really, I think, helped me to like position some of the problems that exist, and it helped me to frame, I
mm,
think, a lot of the challenges that Square Enix has, because they are essentially two separate companies still. And when you think about it through that lens, a lot of the problems that we see make a lot of sense, because um, a lot of like people went into Square Enix as a company liking one of the two previous companies. There were probably people that liked Square and Enix games as well, but especially in the West, Enix didn't really have that much of a footprint. They seldom released any games in North America, and it was very unlikely that Europe got any NX games at all. So outside of Japan, obviously they were very familiar with to Japanese audiences because of the Dragon Quest franchise and some of the other games they produced. But outside of Japan, they were almost non-existent for a lot of us.
mm.
And all of a sudden, when you get the merger of this company, we get a lot of NX games coming out from this new entity, and we're here as Square fans thinking like, okay, what's this? And we're expecting it to be a certain type of game, because I came into liking Square from '97 onwards, and so I had an expectation about what a Square game was going to be like, and certain levels of quality that I expected, and then NX games didn't have that same level of quality and like across the board, or they were in random genres that I wasn't really expecting. And a lot of the time, those games would have been isolated to Japan, but they started getting a bit more prevalence abroad, and it started to create this kind of weird situation where I don't think they really knew what they were. I don't think anyone else really knew what they were. So I think really diving into the NX side of the business helped me to frame things a lot better. So that's probably like the biggest thing that I kind of like learned when I was doing the research. And then of
Mm.
course it's like framing the Square side of the problems around that, because like Square have its problems, have their problems. I think the NX side of the business is probably actually the better side of the business right now. they
Oh, for
they
sure,
seem
for
to know
sure.
they seem to know what they're doing,
Yeah.
and weirdly enough, they don't seem to be adhering to the new company policies, which was, one of the first things Curie said was, we're not going to be outsourcing anymore. We're going to take everything in house. And the NX side were like, yeah, we're still going to be outsourcing.
Right. I think when you have a merger of any two major corporations, there's always this like reconciliation of like the company culture, right? And typically, the one that's more dominant, kind of the company that bought the smaller company, that tends to be the culture that wins overall, right? And you may have some traces within the teams that worked under the previous company, But over time, that eventually gets kind of like washed into one corporate culture. But my understanding of it with Square Enix is that there is still Squaresoft and there is still Enix, and they kind of operate under this umbrella, but there's still two different cultures within this same company, and a lot of the times those cultures are not compatible with each other.
Yeah, and I think like when the companies merged, Yuichi Wada talked about what they hoped to accomplish by the merger, and it was that they wanted to take the strengths of Square and the strengths of Enix and combine them together to create a super company that could take on the world, essentially. They called it an aggressive merger at the time. And I think their hope was that they would be able to take the huge quality and vision and polish that the Square side had, and then combine that with Enix's ability to make games really cheaply using outsourcing partners. So they could increase the frequency of the games without diminishing the quality. And it just never really happened because there were no merging of teams or ideals. They just expected Square employees to suddenly figure out how Enix worked without putting anyone on the Enix side there to mentor or oversee these games. And they expected the Enix side to just figure out how to make better games without giving access to anyone on the Square side. So they were kind of forced to figure things out and work in different ways that they just didn't have the experience to do. And then that's where you start to see on the Square side like the dropping down of quality in terms of what they're doing, because all of a sudden they have to start outsourcing, but they don't have any experience with outsourcing. They use like the Square side of the business is all about control. Like they 100% wanted to be in control of everything that was happening to the minutest of details. And then all of a sudden it's like, no, you gotta outsource that now. And you're not in charge really. You're kind of in charge of the final product, but you don't know the people that are working on this game anymore. So it's a
Mhm.
very different team dynamic. Like imagine if you've been working with the team, some of these people have been working together for over a decade, and all of a sudden they start to kind of split up, and then you'd be able to say, okay, I need like these sprites pulled together a certain way, and but the person you've been using for like the last 10 years is no longer there, so now you've got to outsource it to some other company that Enix work with, but you've never had any experience working with, and you're expecting them to deliver what you want, but they don't really know what you want. So
Right.
it's like you can like when you I think when you frame it like that, it's quite easy to see how it didn't really pan out. I think the only division that is kind of what they wanted it to be is Yoshida's department, right? Because that he's an Enix man, he has all of the Enix ideologies, and he is in charge of a Square property, and you can absolutely see that for better, and I guess now in the 14 community for worse, in that he is incredibly militant. Everything runs like clockwork. There is a lot of quality control around it. He treats the development team like an outsourcing partner, essentially. Like these are the deadlines. This is what you have to do. It's like a full on military operation,
Mm.
and that's how they operate. That's what they do. Like really great budget management and all that kind of stuff. But it's like Enix are yeah, the quality can vary. The quality can
Right.
vary.
Right. Right. And that's also kind of a criticism that I think a lot of the 14 community has regarding some of Creative Studio 3's work is that while it does come out at a steady pace, the cost of that is it maybe feeling formulaic at times. And maybe for a long time now. It seems like Dawn Trail was kind of a breaking point for a lot of people with the structure of the game that they felt had been going a certain way for a long time. But again, it is part of how Yoshi P manages to keep everything um, like running as like a well-oiled machine and coming out at a
Yeah,
frequent cadence, right?
and that's how they were managed. That's how they managed to turn the game around, because everything like they created this cadence where people knew what they were going to get. They knew roughly the quality, and then they would just occasionally sprinkle a few extra things in there, right, to keep people guessing, like when they had the first Ultimate Raid, like those kind of things. But I guess they
Mm.
haven't had that kind of thing for a while now. Like there's nothing beyond the Ultimate Raid, um, because they just do more Ultimate Raids now.
Yeah, yeah, so which actually kind of brings us into the meat of this conversation, right? So recently, 3D Investment Partners released a 122-page document criticizing Square Enix's performance. So, for those who aren't aware, 3D Investment Partners are an activist investment firm. And what that means is that they buy stakes up in a company in order to attempt to unlock its true value. And the hope is that by unlocking this value, they will be able to obviously make money and um, bring those share prices much higher. So they think that any company that they target, they think that that company is undervalued and they want to raise the value of that company. And so that's currently what they're doing with Square Enix. And they own nearly 16% of Square currently, which makes them the second largest shareholder, right behind Yasuhiro Fukushima, who is the creator of Enix, who owns 19%. So it does seem like before long, 3D Investment Partners is going to be the largest shareholder of Square, right? They're around 3% away from it. So,
One caveat there is that the third
mm,
largest shareholder is Fukushima's family. So
mm,
those two combined have a little bit more than 19%. I think it's like 25, 26 when you put
right.
those two together.
Mm,
But yeah, like they are. I mean, there are some conspiracy theorists out there that believe they've done all this to try and make in other shareholders more willing to sell to them at lower prices. Like, all these wonderful things that happen when this kind of stuff happens.
right.
um, but I mean, you and I have been talking about this for a while because they like the great thing about it, but I guess depending on how you look at it, is that they're very public with what they do. It's very transparent. Like you can go on their website and you can see every single thing they've done to all the previous companies that they have owned, and it's a very similar pattern. And we were just waiting for this presentation to land because we knew it was coming at some point. And I even said in my video that like there's going to be a presentation coming at some point. We don't know when. And then they dropped it like 12 hours after I published my video.
Wow. Incredible. That's awesome. But like, I guess, do you think that their goal is to devalue Square so that they can buy up more shares and gain more control? I mean, I do think that clearly, just judging from the patterns over the past year, that they definitely do seem to be wanting to buy more shares and gain more control. I don't think they would be able to enforce anything too major with the current amount of shares that they own, but it seems like they probably won't need to as long as they can convince other shareholders to be on their side, right?
Exactly. And like, it's I don't think this is their objective, but it's not too dissimilar from a hostile takeover, right? Where
Mm,
if that's essentially how these kind of things happen with publicly traded companies, where all they need to do is convince other people to sell to them. Obviously, they have to have enough money to be able to buy the shares off the other people.
mm,
And I don't know if they'll be able to convince Fukushima, for example, to part with his shares because he's obviously the founder of Enix. Um, but there are obviously plenty of other people that are invested that can happen. That can do this. You and I have talked about this, and I don't think you necessarily get it because obviously it's a very English thing. But there are many parallels between Square Enix and Manchester United, the football club. And
mm,
Manchester United actually went through this many years ago with the Glazers when they bought it out. They essentially did a hostile takeover of all the shareholders, and it got very political, and everyone was wrestling for control and power. And ultimately, they won out, and they got the majority vote. I don't think that's necessarily 3D Investment Partners' objective here. I think they're very one-dimensional in that they just want to extract as much value out of Square Enix, and it just so happened that they saw an opportunity here because they saw what I think we all see, that Square Enix are a company that is not fulfilling its potential.
mm,
And I don't think there are many people out there that would say, that they are fulfilling their potential. You can be happy with what Square Enix are doing, but I think there's still an appreciation that they should be doing way better. And I think one of the things that I pulled out from the video is that when Square Enix was formed, they were the fourth largest video game company in the world in terms of the equity, the revenue they were generating. And over the last 20 years, that has just continually dropped down and down and down and down. And so many other companies have overtaken them, despite the fact that Square Enix still own some of the biggest IP in the world of video gaming. Like there's no way around that, and it's just they're like a massively dormant entity that just when they can figure things out and get it right, it's gonna explode because of the scale of what they have, the potential they have, and I think from a positive perspective, if 3D investment partners can like bully them into actually achieving their potential, then that's a great thing all around for all of us. We don't know their true motivations or objectives, but I think like some people have looked at what they've pulled together and being very critical of that because some of the slides in there were
Pretty
childish, I'd
disingenuous.
say.
Yeah.
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 But there was also a lot of stuff in there that was pretty fair, I think, and they echoed some of the points that I had made towards the end of my video, just in a much more aggressive manner than I did, I think. Because like I would love to know what their plans are for their core IP that they own, because we don't really have any idea what they're going to do. You look at some other companies, and even though they don't necessarily publicly say, okay, here's the 10-year roadmap for this IP, you roughly know what their objective is around everything that they're working on. And, like if you look at Capcom, which is obviously the one that everyone points to all the time, it's what 3D investment partners looked at. Like they haven't publicly said what the roadmap is for Resident Evil, but everyone pretty much knows what the roadmap is now. Like we've got RE9 coming out soon, and then we know there's going to be some more remakes that come out. We don't know what remakes they're going to be, but it doesn't really matter. What it could be Zero, it could be Resident Evil 1, it could be Code Veronica, it could be Resident Evil 5. Like they've got lots of potential things, and there's going to be people waiting to play them when they come out because they know it's going to happen. And then while that's happening, then they're going to be working on Resident Evil 10. It's pretty clear, but we don't really have any timelines. We don't have any plans. Like it's going to be coming up to a decade for the next release in all of their major franchises, all of their major IPs, except Final Fantasy. And that's not really an ideal situation.
Right. Yeah. I think the slide that left the biggest impression on me from this whole thing was the slide where they talked about brand recognition in the West. And they showed Final Fantasy was like just below like Pokemon and Mario. And more people are aware of the existence of Final Fantasy than like World of Warcraft and Elden Ring. Mm-hmm. Massive franchises. People were more aware of it then. And then you compare the sales of recent Final Fantasy games, and it is maybe a fraction of like what those bigger, heavier hitters on the list are actually doing. So
I think
people
Final
know what
Fantasy
FF
15,
is. Yeah.
I think Final Fantasy 15 kind of highlights that because it's for many people a very divisive game, and critically, it's an 80s. I think when I did my survey, it was in the 70s amongst the core fan base. But people still really like it. They appreciate what the game is, and it's sold over 11 million copies. And imagine if Final Fantasy 15 had been a 90 plus game, a 95 plus game. Sorry, I said 11. Final Fantasy 15. It was like that caliber of game. That 11 million copies would have been significantly higher. It's just a no brainer. Like if Final Fantasy 15, or if they can make a game that is of the quality and has the impact of a Breath of the Wild, it will sell at the same level as Breath of the Wild, because Zelda and Final Fantasy are, I mean, before Breath of the Wild, Final Fantasy typically sold more than Zelda. Like there aren't
Mm,
too many Zelda games that, I mean, some of them have sold less than 5 million. Most of them landed between the 5 to 10 million mark. I think only one had gone over 10 million, maybe Ocarina of Time. Whereas multiple Final Fantasy games are over 10 million. I think we're just kind of waiting for that moment to happen for our franchise, for it to be reinitialized and like where everything, all the stars align. When the stars align, it's just going to be explode.
right. And I guess not to go off too much on a tangent on game design and stuff like that. I just feel like as much as like Final Fantasy fans focus purely on battle system, I think that type of revolutionary game design is going to come from a multitude of things that are happening in the game, from a lot of its deeper systems, its exploration. And I think we do tend to like focus on just like the cutscenes and the combat alone. And I think that when you look at the games that have had the biggest impact over the past decade and a half, they're usually firing off on all cylinders for, or at least the ones that are important to the type of game that they're trying to make. And so, I do think that Square probably needs to dig deeper into that in order to make that type of revolutionary um, game if they want to reach those numbers, right? So, but yeah, but that all costs a lot of money. It's not cheap. And some of the sales, or not the sales, but the development costs, sales and development costs really, for games like Final Fantasy 16 were listed in the document. And this is what caused a lot of discussion, right? Because it had something like 3.23 million for Final Fantasy 16, which is absurd. Like, that would basically mean that 3 million shipped and sold in the first week. That would mean heavy emphasis on shipped. I don't know. What do you make of those numbers? Do you think that's legit? Do you think that they're just rounding with public information? What's going on there?
It's a weird one because I was looking at it from the perspective of, okay, so we know that they made this presentation and presented it to the board of Square Enix. So if they were going there with really bad numbers, then that would kind of be embarrassing, right, for them.
Mm,
Like, okay, here's how much your game sold, and they're just thinking, they're like, well, that's not what our game sold. What are you talking about? Like,
hmm.
that would kind of undermine the point they're trying to make to the people they're trying to make it to, because ultimately, like the presentation, uh, obviously they've done it publicly to try and
Mm,
cause a stink, right? But they did present it to Square Enix first about like a month or two ago. And yeah, you'd like to think that they presented these numbers in good faith, that they actually believe that this is the current state of play. And I remember, I think it was early this year, wasn't there, that the whole thing came around that Final Fantasy 16 had sold around like between 3 and 3.5 million, and everyone was really confused about that because I think you and I were all, if it sold 3 million at launch, then it must be way beyond that now, probably in the
right.
4 to 5 million range, especially with the PC launch. But then the thing came out earlier this year where it's like, actually, no, it's about 3.5 million. And then, but it came out that it was misquoted and all this kind of stuff. And then, but even at that time, people were starting to dig into the wording, and Square's press release was that it was not 3 million sold, it was 3 million shipped to retailers and digital sales, which is a very different metric. It means that they sold 3 million copies from their distribution to retailers. That doesn't mean they've sold any more to retailers after that point.
Mm,
And it doesn't mean that there are 3 million copies in homes. It just means that there are 3 million copies out at retail. So I don't like, until Square actually declare it. Like we honestly don't know whether those numbers are real or not. I
mm,
think that's the reality of it. The only figure we've ever had is 3 million, and until Square give us an updated figure, then it's either 3 million or we. Some people can estimate in the 4 millions, 4.5 millions, but it's all just estimations at the end of the
right.
day. If they felt it's about 3.2, 3.3, then they must have felt pretty confident around that. And I guess you could see it from Square's own messaging as well to a degree, where they initially said that their sales were not the best, but they were on par with what they'd expected, off the bat for that initial launch shipment. But then they changed their messaging towards the end of the year to say that the sales were now disappointing. So they went from being on par and not at the level we wanted to, okay, now it's not doing anywhere near as well as we wanted. Um, so it's a hard one. So I don't think there's any real benefit from 3D investment partners lying or making up numbers. I think they've gone in with the best that they can. And maybe it is a situation where they've come up with these numbers to try and force Square Enix to actually release the true numbers.
Yeah.
But that's just kind of, it's just theories, rumors. We don't know. Ultimately, that's the numbers they presented. They're obviously the numbers they believe to be true. And until Square Enix says otherwise, I mean, you can take it how you want, really. And it's the same with the development costs as well. I mean, Square Enix have never publicly said the development costs for any of their games, and I don't think they ever probably will. They used to quite regularly
Mm.
talk about development costs. We know the development costs of Final Fantasy 7 through 10, but they started being a bit more covert with their operations in that regard. But there have been tons of, again, estimates put out based on development time, staff costs, quantity of staff that generally put remake in the sort of 150 range, maybe 200 at a push.
Mm.
Um, and yeah, it's not too unrealistic when you look at the size of AAA development these days. So I think obviously the third 16 is the red herring there, but we don't know if that is Square Enix's cost. There probably was some kind of agreement with PlayStation that Yoshida talked a lot about the amount of support they got from PlayStation and from a marketing perspective and a development perspective and how it was saving them a ton of money. So, you know,
Yeah. Yeah. Because I want to say, don't quote me on this one, but I want to say that there was a mention of Sony maybe approving some of the budgets for the icon fights that I want to say I remember reading over. I may be entirely misremembering that. However, one thing I'm not misremembering was something that I dug up recently for a video. It was on a Japanese talk show called Weekly Ochi. And I remember reading that transcription, and on there, Yoshi P was basically saying that he wouldn't be the one to want to look at Final Fantasy 16's first numbers, like first week numbers. And now that I'm thinking about this and what they're saying in this document, I'm kind of like, oh, because if they really sold 3 million in that first week, and that was a strong, and that was a strong indicator of what was to come, the pre-orders likely would have reflected that. And it would seem odd to me for him to make kind of a nervous statement about that a few weeks before launch if leading into it they had pre-orders that were showing numbers like that, right? I don't understand why he would be indicating any type of nervousness about those first week sales. So that alone kind of shows me that there is something there. And then also, every publicly traded company, anytime they can turn something around and make it look like a W, they will, right? Because that makes their stock price go up. It shows that they're strong. So anytime they can be strong, they will be. And typically, when they're at their strongest, that's when they are most transparent because they benefit from that transparency, right? They can say, look at this, look at the growth that we're achieving. The only real way I can think of, or the only real reason I can think of to not be transparent about something like the sales for these games and then only vaguely comment wasn't enough, you know, is if they are really underperforming in such a way that it is worse to communicate how bad it is than to just say it wasn't to our expectations. Does that make sense to you?
yeah, no, absolutely makes sense to me. And yeah, I think that's absolutely why they're doing it because, I mean, like if you look back at Square Enix's old financial reports, like the first couple of years of them trading as Square Enix, they used to absolutely talk about how their games were performing. You'd got sales figures to the 10,000s, and they were broken down by region. Um, they would talk about every single release in that year and how much they'd sold. They'd also talk about like sell through from previous years. And then all of a sudden, when Square Enix stopped doing so well towards the end of like the noughties, they started to become more opaque about their reporting. They didn't really talk about it that much anymore. And it's no coincidence that the only things they're doing sales updates for right now, they just did another one for the Pixel remasters, for example, right? It's an easy win for them. Nier is constantly getting sales updates, and Dragon Quest 11 is like they're the kind of like the win franchises they have, or the win properties they have right now. So they just keep updating just those in isolation, and then everything else just kind of gets swept under the carpet, and we don't know how they're doing. I think the fact that they've not revealed any sales figures at all for Rebirth is, I don't want to say it's damning, but it's not ideal. But then you can infer it anyway, because all you've got to do is look at the Japanese physical sales, and it's not quite like a direct comparison with Remake, because obviously Remake was kind of during COVID, like where the switch to digital was happening. So there is a natural reduction in physical copies anyway. But, people physically still turned out for the Dragon Quest 3 remake, and that sold significantly better than Rebirth, as did like Monster Hunter Wilds, for example. Like there's still plenty of physical gamers out there, and they just weren't interested in Rebirth, apparently. In Japan, at least.
So, in terms of Final Fantasy specifically, I have to ask, where do you think we go from here? Do you think that it is a game of them trying to continue to make a AAA product and sell that to more people as they've been doing? Or do you think that now is probably the time to scale down in light of this and try to make something more cost effective and then work your way back up from there?
That's a very large question, right?
It is.
I think that the approach they take with Final Fantasy is the approach they have to adopt for almost everything that they're doing, honestly. And it's that they need to try and figure out what separates this franchise out from every other franchise in the market. Once they've got that, they then need to figure out like who's in charge of making sure that that is maintained, and how can we make this as quickly as possible.
Yeah.
Within the budgets, because ultimately, Hollywood's going through the same thing right now. There was a period of time where the Avengers movies were making absolute bank, and the budgets could go up because the return on investment was there. And then all of a sudden the return on investment stops being there. So then you have to scale the budgets back. It's just a natural thing, isn't it? You can't just keep spending money and just kind of throwing it away. So they need to try and figure out how they can make these games cheaper, and they need to try and figure out how they can make them faster. And then the easiest way to do that is to come up with, this is what each game is, because then a lot of the decisions are already made for you. You don't have to come up with everything from scratch every single time, which is a big problem the entire industry is having right now, which is why we're seeing these 7 to 8 year development cycles, because everything seems to need to be made from scratch every single time. And it's honestly mental. And the fact that Square Enix came out and said that they were able to make Rebirth so quickly because they suddenly figured out that if they didn't disband the entire development team between games, that it was more efficient, was honestly mind blowing. Like when that was said, it was kind of like, wait, what? Like, why would you do
Yeah.
that? Like,
It's like they had the great
surely,
discovery that 2 + 2 = 4.
yeah, exactly.
And they were like,
It's
whoa.
it's crazy. I mean, like, ultimately, there's I think when I don't want to harken back to the kind of good old days, but Sakaguchi was very militant around certain things, and deadlines was one of them. He knew from the beginning, and this is why Final Fantasy overtook Dragon Quest in terms of volume of sales in Japan, not necessarily prestige of an IP, but definitely volume of sales in Japan, and it took it from being a pretender to absolutely a comparable brand. Is that we need to be out on a regular cadence. That is it. That is how you build the IP. Like, if we can't be the absolute best, we have to be at least there in the conversation more frequently than they are, at a high standard too. Not necessarily the highest standard, but at a high standard. And you start to see it where, there was between Final Fantasy 1 and 10, I don't think there was ever apart from like the gap between 6 and 7, which kind of happened for numerous reasons. There's not really a period of more than 2 years before a new Final Fantasy game comes out, and that's going through this, like, that's 4 console generations. The development times didn't significantly increase or for Final Fantasy, but they did for Dragon Quest. Dragon Quest went from, okay, we've had 4 games on the Famicom to 1 on the Super Famicom, I think, maybe 2, and then there's just 1 on the PlayStation, 1 on the PlayStation 2, and then there's nothing like then there was the DS. So they like almost to the point where they were skipping entire console generations. Someone has just told me that Final Fantasy has never sold more than Dragon Quest in Japan. I am well aware that no single entry has ever outsold a game, but in the 16-bit era, Final Fantasy definitely sold more copies than Dragon Quest as a collective, and that's the point.
Right.
And there's an interview where Yuji Horii is lamenting the fact that he can't figure out how to make games as fast, and Sakaguchi's like, "Yeah, bro, like." We've got this mentality where we get a game out every like 1 or 2 years, and they got Final Fantasy 4 and 5 out in the time that they got Dragon Quest 5 out. So therefore, the sales were comparable. Like, they weren't Final Fantasy, as I said before, like Final Fantasy is not a bigger brand than Dragon Quest in Japan, but its sales collectively are not too dissimilar when you join them all up together. And they did it just because they just had so many games. Like Final Fantasy 7, 8, and 9 compared to Dragon Quest 7. When you put the sales all together, it's very clear which one is bigger.
Right. Yeah. Exactly.
And that's how they did it. And like they've lost that ability to do that. I think they have to get back to that. Like, and it's a wider industry problem, and a lot of studios are starting to figure out. CD Projekt Red have just come out and said that the Witcher 4 trilogy they're spending a bit of time up front, and then after the first game comes out, there's going to be a 2-year cadence between each game,
which is absolutely crazy, especially for the size and quality of those games. Really, just absolutely mind blowing. But this is kind of why I drill that point home so frequently about, they have like a lot of good fan reception for Final Fantasy VII Remake's combat. So I'm like, okay, keep iterating on it, keep doing something with it, right? Versus throwing that out for something else, right? And even though these numbers, we don't necessarily believe them to be maybe be 100% true or 100% accurate. One thing that it does point out that is probably true is that Rebirth cost something like $20 million less than Remake. It's probably an actual proportion to like how much less it did cost. And Rebirth is a tremendously bigger game that was developed much faster and with far fewer hiccups than Final Fantasy VII Remake, and definitely more or less than Final Fantasy 15. And we don't really know with Final Fantasy 16, but I would assume that even still, because it took half the time, probably less. And it's a game that's so big that one of its primary criticisms is that there's just too much. It's overwhelming. I get burnt out playing it, right? So it's a game that they were able to make so massive in such a short time and it costs less than the last thing. And we can presume that this trend will continue into the third part, where it will also be a very massive game, but it will probably cost less than Rebirth or Remake to produce. Part of that is asset reuse. And then the other part of it is just code and infrastructure, and the team knows how to go about it and make a game. And, we see this from Falcom, we see this from Studio RGG and the Like a Dragon games. And we're seeing this from a lot of major studios who are able to release these games at a very steady cadence. And so what I keep seeing happening with Final Fantasy is that they are spending millions of dollars in order to reinvent themselves, but that millions of dollars isn't seeing an ROI in terms of brand new fans or reaching, massive new audiences. All it seems to really be doing is dividing their core audience even further, right? So that they'll spend money and make something like Final Fantasy 16's battle system, and some people will love it, and then some people will hate it, but there isn't a bunch of new people coming in to even have an opinion on it, period, right? So it seems
Yeah,
like
they're just dividing the existing people.
yeah, they're just making like the existing people, some of them love it, some of them hate it, but like they're not creating new people, right? So what I can't understand is that why are we continuing to do that under the guise that Final Fantasy has to completely dump everything out when historically that has not been true, and the ROI for doing that is minimal,
It
if not
it's
negative.
been historically true in the Square Enix era, just not in the Square era. And I think
Right.
this then points back to that lack of vision for what the franchise actually is. And I don't think there is. I mean, they had that kind of Final Fantasy oversight committee that was put in place, and Kataz is the brand manager. But when you have the brand manager saying Final Fantasy can be whatever you want it to be, like it doesn't really matter. Like,
I've never heard any brand manager say that, by the way, about any brand ever.
what are your brand guidelines? There aren't any. Okay, cool. Let's go.
That was just
You have
so
to use this font.
unfathomable. Yeah. Talking,
I think
talking to people who work in brands and brand management about that quote, they were so floored by it because they were like, what are you doing? Brands are so particular about every single thing, down to fonts and colors and textures and like what is appropriate. And so I don't know, to just say do whatever you think is the best game, which already is like hugely
well,
subjective.
I mean, it that
Yeah.
quote itself is kind of. I
Yeah.
mean, like the one of the big Dragon Quest people quit recently because he said that Square Enix are just a trend chasing company, and that quote essentially just says that, right? It's like make Final Fantasy whatever you think is the best game in that moment. So whatever you think's on trend right now, just make Final Fantasy that, and then it will sell because it's got the Final Fantasy brand on it. And that, especially when I was doing my book research, that came out as a common trend for it, that someone was working on a game that had a slightly different niche or a slightly different spin on an RPG, and then all of a sudden they were like, "Wait, you know what would make this game sell more if we called it a Final Fantasy game?" And then the biggest one that always comes to mind is Final Fantasy 12 Revenant Wings. That
Mhm.
was never meant to be a Final Fantasy 12 game. It was meant to be a Final Fantasy game, but it was meant to be like a specific. It's a real time strategy game. It's like they were
Right.
supposed to be using it to like kind of baby's first introduction to Final Fantasy through a slightly different medium. It's being created by like Motomo Toriyama as a side project while he's also working on 13,
Mm.
and which is crazy itself, like him creating two games concurrently. Um, and then they were like, "Yeah, by the way, this needs to be a Final Fantasy 12 game." And even though no one working this game worked on 12, you just got to figure out how to incorporate all of Final Fantasy 12's mechanics into this adjacent genre, and you've also got to tie it in with the story that you didn't write. Um, and then in for the marketing, we're not actually, even though it's a 12 game, we're not going to call it it's a pseudo sequel, right? It's not a full sequel,
Hmm.
it's a pseudo sequel.
Yeah. I feel they do this with Final Fantasy VII a lot too, right? Once with Dirge of Cerberus, when shooters were getting really popular and they wanted to make one, so they were like, let's throw Final Fantasy VII on it. And then they did the exact same thing again with the first Soldier, where they were like, battle royale games are popular. Let's throw Final Fantasy VII at it, right? So I do think that for particularly Final Fantasy, that just stronger brand guidelines are needed. And I don't even think it has to be as formulaic as I think a lot of people are imagining, where it's like as strict. But I feel like when you look at Final Fantasy 1 through 10, they had those kind of guidelines in place, and that allowed those games to thrive. And one of
Yeah,
the
and
things that I think about now is that we don't even have a like who is the guy that's actually in charge of all of Final Fantasy, right? Kitase, it's there's no clear visionary for the whole series.
I think that's the challenge. I don't know if they ever had explicit brand guidelines before in the past, but what they did have was a continuity. And if you look at, I shared something with you before the stream, Ryan, of like all
Hmm.
this like screenshots from all of Square's 16-bit RPGs, and they all kind of look the same. They either have like the blue menu that everyone knows so well, like that same gradient on it, with the command menu, like the sprites look similar-ish. And it's because like if you think about like Final Fantasy and Romancing Saga, right? They were their two premium IP that they had throughout the 16-bit era. One was designed as a linear RPG, one was designed as a non-linear RPG, and from an art direction perspective, Kazuko Shibuya was like in charge of all the sprites across all six of those games, basically. But then you also had other people like Nomura came in with five, like Takahashi came in with five, and then they worked on six, were given more autonomy, and then Nomura worked on seven, so he knew what was expected from a Final Fantasy game in this kind of new era, which he didn't really no one had any experience with whatsoever. But it like for many people, obviously, that seven was divisive for some people that had come in with the 16-bit era.
Hmm.
But it doesn't seem like too much of a mental leap to be like, okay, those sprites look like this, because
Hmm.
Nomura had worked on the two previous games too. Takahashi worked on a little bit as well. A lot of the same people were working on all of these games. Like Chrono Trigger is another great one where a lot of the people that worked on the art for that, some of them came from Final Fantasy, some of them came from Secret of Mana. So
Hmm.
you have like UI elements from the Final Fantasy franchise, but you have like sprites that are a bit more like Secret of Mana because it's a bit more action focused in terms of the way it works. And like, a lot of people say that the protagonist of Secret of Mana looks very similar to Chrono. Um, like there are all these similarities in terms of the art, and especially these days, art is such an important part of it. And the challenge that Square have is that they're constantly changing the visual identity of the franchise. Gameplay is obviously one thing as well, but yeah, it's hard to look at one now and think like, yeah, it's a Final Fantasy game.
Hmm.
And I think that's one of the challenges that they do have. And
Yeah.
it's one of the things that Sakaguchi was even trying to implement, when he went out as well. He wanted the games to have slightly different visual identities to appeal to different people, and that's fine. But there's no
Hmm.
consistency with any of them, and I think that's the challenge. He at least wanted consistency between like 7, 8, 10, consistent team, consistent direction. It's like that's Nomura's vision, and then you're going to have 9, which was Itahana and a few other
Hmm.
people. Like Shibuya was on 9 as well, so it's more of a continuation of like 6, and obviously they wanted that to continue as well. And then 12 was continuation of like the tactics style, um, but it's kind of lost though that consistency now because the people working on like there was consistency between 16 and 14, right? You can see
Yeah.
that very clearly. Um, but it's difficult because 15 had consistency with a bit like of versus like the original Vision, but it was also a lot of the Type Zero team that came into that one, and then really helps to build that out. And the Type Zero team would kind of worked on before Crisis and Crisis Core and stuff, and not really the same kind of games as the other things. Um, so I think it's that consistency that they used to have, and they got that consistency because they worked on so many games in such a short space of time,
Mm,
right? People
yeah.
got the experience of working on those games, and then when they were promoted into more senior positions, then they would put a slightly different spin on what they were taught.
Mm.
And I think that's kind of what's like the lineage is kind of been lost a little bit.
Right. When I think about Final Fantasy brand management, I think back to Final Fantasy VII's development, and I think about how they had so many golden ideas that were pitched to them. And any idea that they felt like was not fit for the Final Fantasy brand became a new IP. Whereas now it feels like that same type of filtering doesn't necessarily happen. I'm sure they have pitches internally that they don't feel like is a fit for Final Fantasy, but it feels like they aren't saying to the same degree, okay, maybe going in this direction goes too far from what people expect from Final Fantasy, so we'll make that like a new IP. It feels like they're just like, that sounds like it can sell 10 million units. Let's do that. you know, there is a question in chat that I also think is really important for the sake of the clarity in the points that we're making. Final Fantasy File says, but that relies on Final Fantasy reventing themselves into something that some Zelda fans didn't agree with, no temples, etc. So how can Final Fantasy break out if they never change? Um, I wanted to comment on that and basically say that if you really think about it, with Final Fantasy VII, it really didn't do a lot gameplay wise different than Final Fantasy VI. It mostly elevated the production values of everything that had come before it to the highest level possible. And that is what made Final Fantasy VII stand out. And it's not just FF7, really. You could look at Persona 5. There's nothing that Persona 5 does that Persona 4 did not, other than better dungeon design. And that's pretty much it. For the most part, Persona 5 is mostly iterative on everything that came before it. However, what the big difference was with P5 compared to 3 and 4 is that they upped the production values of it to a million. The better menus. They invested a lot more on music. They again invested a lot more on better dungeon design, on better character models and visuals. But for the most part, Persona 5 is like Persona 4 in a multitude of ways. And so they will continue to do things differently from game to game, and they should. However, it's really the consistency leading up to 7 that enabled 7 to happen. The consistency, well, maybe not so much as with Persona because they shifted styles, but even then it's still there from 3 to 5, right? They had a consistent formula that they came up with Persona 3, and they iterated on it until they came up with Persona 5, which managed to reach 10 million. And so you can look at, say, Elden Ring. Elden Ring is iterative of every single FromSoft game that came before it, and then they hit they hit the gold mine eventually with Elden Ring, where they introduced the open world and upped the production value to a million and did all of those things. And so I think that's a formula that they've done before, and it's a formula that you see happening in other adjacent IPs. And I think that's just all they need to do from the way I personally see it. If you have anything to add or disagree with that, you can feel free.
No, I think what you're saying is completely accurate. Uh, Weirdly, I mean, like, people always hark back to Final Fantasy X. That was I saw someone saying that all the PlayStation games are completely different, and that's definitely one perspective. But I think there was a very clear evolutionary visual style between 7, 8, and 10. 9 is the outlier there, but it was intentionally different on their part, and some people didn't like it because it was visually different. And But 7, 8, and 10 is very clear that they were trying to make realistic looking characters. But when you look at how the games are presented, they're still very similar. Like 7 had the pre-rendered backgrounds. 8 still had the pre-rendered backgrounds. 10 they moved away from the pre-rendered backgrounds, but they still had fixed camera angles because they technically couldn't go beyond that, and that was the next evolution they were planning to do to make it so you can move the camera around. The battle sequence, the camera angles are very, very similar. The
Hmm.
menus are very similar. The way the characters move and animate is very similar, especially between like 8 and 10. There's a lot of things that are very similar between 7, 8, and 10. It's just a natural progression that they got better at doing the thing that they were doing, taking use of the hardware that was available to them. If they produced a game that was a ramped up version of 10 right now, Expedition 33 just showed that that could be very successful.
Hmm. Yeah. It's sometimes the case that you come out with a revolutionary game on the first attempt, but usually the games that break a huge milestone, it's because they've been working at something for a while. And I would argue that even with something like Breath of the Wild, which does change up the Zelda formula a lot, I would say that it's still identifiably Zelda in a lot of ways. I mean, even though, say, the temple structure isn't there, you still have shrines, right? And shrines still function like smaller temples. And all of the Zelda trappings that you would think of are still there in some form. However, it's changed in the way in which they're presented and which you interact with them. And some stuff you may not like as much, some stuff you may like more. However, it's all there and it all is trying to acknowledge that this is what a Zelda game has. We're presenting it to you in a different way, but it's still fundamentally Zelda. That's not quite the same, I think, with, say, Final Fantasy, right? Where it's just like no airships, no playable party members, none of these things that people ask for every single game, regardless of the fact that it's been gone for most of them for like, 2 decades. Um, so I do think that even though it did radically change, um, there was still kind of there's still a through line that I see from the first Zelda all the way to Breath of the Wild, right? That really makes it still identifiably Zelda. So some people on YouTube are saying that there are some audio skips, but I asked people on Twitch and they say it's fine. So I don't know. But it doesn't matter because when I upload this, I have it recorded through Riverside, so there will be no skips. So if you're having buffering problems or something, the video will be up later and it will not have any issues. Anyway, so I want to ask, do you think Square Enix is going to be better or worse off as a company as a result of all this? I know it's a hard question to ask.
I hope it's positive. As I said at the beginning, you have to hope that it's going to be a positive thing, and that 3D investment partners are kind of forcing their hands to become the best that they can be. And hopefully they do make Square Enix be a bit more transparent about what their plans are, because I think the last couple of years have been quite difficult for the fan base. There have been a lot of false dawns around certain things. It's been like it's honestly it's very confusing. I think is kind of how you look at it. Like,
Mm,
because a lot of the collaboration events they do don't necessarily always make sense. And all it does is just create a lot of conspiracy theories around stuff. Like, if they were just much clearer with their plans, like if they just came out and said, yeah, like we were hoping to do this but just didn't pan out, like I think people would be quite accepting of that. Sure, people would be initially upset, but ultimately it is what it is. Like,
right.
if they came out and just shared like a brief vision for what the plan is. I mean, like Yoshida kind of does it a little bit, right? He's talking about already starting to talk about the next expansion and what he's hoping for it, and he's kind of ramping that up a little bit. But for the rest of the brand, I mean, we are kind of in the dark ages outside
Mm,
of the part three of the remake, which they've come out and said they don't have a name for yet, still, and they're hoping to have that nailed down soon. Um, and the next expansion for Final Fantasy 14, there is no plan for the brand as far as we're aware of. Like, they're probably doing stuff behind the scenes, but there's nothing else. We have no officially announced Final Fantasy game as of right now, unless I'm missing something.
right. I think that you can go a lot longer when you kind of have that established faith in your audience. Like, for example, when Persona 6 comes out, I don't think that it'll be a big deal for Atlas, given how
There's stuff
long it's
happening though,
been.
right?
Right,
It's
right. And there's always Persona stuff happening, and then we have the remakes to kind of keep us there. But also too, I think you're kind of only viewed as good as your last up at bat. And so one of the things about Resident Evil right now is that I don't even need to see anything from RE9. I know what Capcom quality is. I know what they do with these games, and I'm gonna buy it. I would buy it without needing to ever see a single trailer from it or know anything about it because I know what Capcom's output is.
yeah, and I think that was one of the big things that I kind of uh, finished up with in my video, that Square Enix has a lot of individual fans. Like there are lots of fans of
Hmm.
Square IP. There are lots of fans of Enix IP, but Square Enix has not really made an IP. Like they're still resting on IPs that were created before the merger outside of Nier, but Dragon Guard was already in development before the merger happened. Um, Whereas, Capcom, you can be a Capcom content creator now, like
Mm,
legitimately, like across all of them. You can be talking about Resident Evil and Monster Hunter, and I mean,
mm,
Monster Hunter is kind of its own, slightly its own niche. But even within that niche, you've got, like the kind of the main games, and then the non-main games like Rise, which obviously caused controversy recently with the comments. Um, but you also have like, Devil May Cry, you got Street Fighter, and then Onimusha's coming back, like it's like, because you know what you're going to get with a Capcom game now. It's going to be a certain level of quality. The new IPs are can be hit and miss.
right.
Like Exoprimal is one, for example. But I feel like they use those to experiment, so that when they do something with their main established IPs, they're less likely to screw up or screw around. Like they use those new IPs to just try stuff out. Like Kunitsugami was just a very experimental game that appealed to a certain group of people.
Mm,
I don't think it was like bad by any stretch of the imagination. It was just very niche. But I'm sure there's going to be elements of what they learned when making that they will be able to incorporate into their other games, because everything's on the same engine and they all work with each other, and it's very, very
mm.
collaborative as a company. So you can see the DNA across everything.
Yeah. And
Um,
one thing
Whereas
a chatter
Square don't really
mentioned,
have that.
yeah, one thing a chatter mentioned is that I feel like brand recognition is not there post Nomada character designs. Characters designs felt like they used to be a huge part of FF. Yeah, I mean, and that's
And
like
the
kind of a
company,
thing
right? It
too.
wasn't just
Yeah,
FF.
yeah.
Parasite Eve was, like the bouncer. Like there were other games that he was very much a part of, that he helped to
Mm,
steer the identity of.
yeah. For anyone that's experiencing audio skips on YouTube, there is the Twitch version has no audio skips for whatever reason. I don't know why. So you can go on there if you are having any audio issues. But yeah, it's one of those things where obviously Nomada is not going to be around forever. And so they definitely would have to figure that out, just like with Uematsu, you know, and him, he's
Who's
Uematsu
his
is
successor?
right. He doesn't really have a clear successor. He has successors, but there's not like a clear guy who's like um the successor. And of course, there's no clear visionary for the core of Final Fantasy as it currently stands. And someone in chat earlier with the super chat had said they thought that Nomura should be brand manager, but I can tell you quite strongly with a great degree of confidence, he has no interest in being a brand manager.
I mean, it's the Kingdom Hearts brand manager
Yeah.
ish, right? Like Hazama is, I think, the official Kingdom Hearts brand manager, but I'm pretty sure that Nomura is the one who's like, no, this is Kingdom Hearts, right?
Yeah.
He's got
Yeah.
a very clear vision for what that franchise is. Just like Yuji Horii has it for Dragon Quest, and like maybe he doesn't care so much anymore. But for a very long time, Yuji Horii was adamant. I mean, even now with the HD 2D remakes, they had to go through him. Like everything had to be approved by him. Like
Mm.
this, and he decided whether or not it was a Dragon Quest worthy game or not.
Oh wow. Big super chat here from Subtext. And this one's a question for you. He says Darryl mentioned waiting for an FF to reach a 90 Metacritic. Rebirth reached that, yet sales are still questionable. What are the odds that Square Enix bets on building off that quality momentum or shifting away in response from sales? Now, I'm sure that they're pretty satisfied with the Game of the Year nomination and the Metacritic, but yeah, that does beg the question.
So I actually said like 95, 90-ish because I was
Yeah.
trying to make the Breath of the Wild comparison, which I think was in the 95 plus range, right? But obviously, like the caveat with Rebirth is that it was a direct sequel to something, so
Mm,
it already hinders its ability to sell, and I think that's one of the things that Square Enix has never really been able to figure out in the way that some other companies have. Like, we've talked about Assassin's Creed before and Mass Effect. Both of those had sequels that managed to sell more than their
mm,
predecessors. Um, but with the Rebirth, yeah, it was a very, very high quality game, but it was also a gate kept game. So it was
mm,
a hard game to recommend if you like as a first entry into it. Um, if they managed to figure out how to like create a game that has all of the same qualities of Rebirth that is not related to Final Fantasy VII, you'd
mm.
probably well, you'd hope it would sell better because it would be easier
Yeah.
for people to recommend.
Yeah. I can't tell people play Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, right?
Not off
Because
the bat.
right. I have to tell them to play Final Fantasy VII Remake first. And that's the bottleneck. And
And
so,
that's like technically you don't need to, right? But it's
yeah.
hard to understand what's going on. I think with like Assassin's Creed 2, there was obviously an ongoing story that happened, but it was also a self-contained game. You didn't really need to know what was happening in the broader story. And with Mass Effect 2, again, they did a really good job of making it self-contained. And you didn't
Mm,
really need to play any other ones. I think the Yakuza franchise is kind of like that as well. Like you don't really need to have played the previous ones to figure out what's going on. And they put all those like movies in that help to explain the core story beats of what happened before. And
yeah.
um, like I think that there's other franchises that do a good job with it, but yeah, I think Rebirth was just hard to recommend, even though it's like a
Mm,
phenomenal game. Like it's hard to recommend to people on
mm.
that basis.
So, former Square Enix director of business, Jacob Novick, he's been on Twitter lately. He loves talking about this stuff, but I love reading his threads on it because it's usually pretty insightful. He says that Square Enix needs to realize that they're competing with the Claire Obscures of the world and not the Call of Duties of the world. What do you make of that statement?
I think it's fair. Yeah, I think it's fair. Like especially right now. If you even if you look at the US sales that's just come out, the highest grossing games in the US, the highest grossing game this year was Battlefield 6, first person shooter,
Mm,
and Kingdom Come Deliverance 2 was in the list. Monster Hunter Wilds was in the list. So if you build an IP up that you can get in there, but it's hard. But Square Enix don't have the IP equity at the moment to be able to leverage that. They don't have like the like Kingdom Come Deliverance was obviously like a really hardcore fan base, and Kingdom Come Deliverance
Mm,
2 delivered on everything that the people wanted it to be. Monster Hunter Wilds hasn't necessarily delivered on what people wanted it to be, but
mm,
it was a credit in the bank situation, right? They got all those sales because everyone had such a phenomenal time with Monster Hunter Worlds, and like Wilds hasn't necessarily lived up to that because it's hard a live service game. Um, but I think yeah, like they need to take a step back, you know, and yeah, try and find themselves again. I think is ultimately what it is. You know, Call of
yeah.
Duty is a machine. It is an absolute machine. And even they're stumbling a little bit right now, and they're trying to reinvent themselves a little bit with the next one they've already announced. They have a plan for their vision for the franchise, right? They've
Yeah.
announced already what they're looking to do because Black Ops 7 hasn't done what they hoped it would do. Um, and yeah, I think it's absolutely a fair statement that is who they're competing with.
Right.
But they've always thought that, especially based on what happened during the PlayStation era, they were the Call of Duty during the PlayStation era,
Right.
and during the PlayStation 2 era to a degree as well. Like Final Fantasy X was still one of the best selling games from that era. Um, but then the lack of frequency, the loss of brand equity after 10 just really hindered it. It hindered the franchise,
Mm,
and
mm.
they need that spark.
Yeah, because whenever I think about something gaining viral traction, it tends to be from the core base outward. So you have to make something that the core fan is really enthusiastic about, such that they go and tell every single person they know, this is the one, you need to play it. And I feel like with most Final Fantasies of late, it has kind of not had that momentum, in part because there will be some type of hangup that will prevent it from achieving that. Oh, it looks like the YouTube version of the stream died.
Both of those had sequels that matter,
Oops.
okay, for me.
Really? Yeah. Some people are saying it died. No, wait, I'm looking at it. It's fine. Some people are saying the Twitch stream died. What the hell? Did the Twitch stream die? No, I'm looking at the Twitch stream and it's fine. It's back? Okay. Well, whatever the fuck. What the fuck was I talking about for you before this happened? God.
We were talking about the comparison between Call of Duty and Expedition 33,
Oh, okay.
how yeah they need to realize that they're not a market leader anymore, but they need to get back to being that.
Yeah. Um, so the thing of it is that while they kind of continue to divide the existing base, I think that kind of the lesson for them from Claire Obscure is that they probably could make a game that is a lot cheaper, turn based, which also would make it a lot cheaper, and they would not have to spend nearly as much as they are on these massive AAA adjacent things that they're trying to do right now, and they would still have a very well received game. I think that's like the big takeaway from E33's success, is that obviously E33, while not being like literally a Final Fantasy, it is something that is probably close enough, an approximation of what most people consider Final Fantasy to be. And according to Sandfall, they made that game for under 10 million. There is some skepticism on that claim, but I think we can all agree that it was a lot cheaper to make than, say, what pretty much any other AAA game you would compare it to. So that tells me that there is a way to make Final Fantasy for not nearly as expensive as we currently make Final Fantasy.
The other thing is that that game took debatably less time to make than Final Fantasy VII Remake,
Mm.
with maybe less than 10% of the staff.
Yeah, yeah, and just really clever outsourcing, and then that's all they had to do, right? I mean, I guess that Square Enix had outsourcing too. At first, they had outsourcing the CyberConnect 2, which was terrible, and
Yeah,
then
which then goes back to our initial points around them not being
yeah,
really that experienced with outsourcing and working
mm,
with in that regard.
yeah, and
I don't,
just
I mean, I still don't know how that situation happened, right? Where it's like the biggest game that they could probably make. They outsourced it to a company that, they've made pretty good games, but they've not really made any world class games.
yeah,
CyberConnect 2. And it took them like a year and a half ish to realize, this isn't really kind of looking how we want it to look.
mm.
And then Nomura has to come in and be like, yeah, you guys are out. Like, we're taking it over. We're gonna fix this. And I think they still ended up working with them like on some outsourcing stuff, but ultimately, like, you look at that initial cloud versus like the Nomura fixed
mm,
cloud, and it's like
mm.
uncanny
So
valley.
yeah, it was the most jank looking thing ever, and so I do think that them getting better outsourcing partners and really considering who they want to work for outsourcing is tremendously key to this. But I do think that there is a way to scale down Final Fantasy and it still have all the appeal and maybe even more than um, than it does now. I mean, like for example, if you were to take Assassin's Creed and give it a world map, I don't think people would be. I think people would be pretty upset, right? Because it'd be something that's so fundamentally different than like what people expect from maybe that series. But I think if you give Final Fantasy a world map, people would be elated, right? And the world map's cost is not going to be nearly as big as say an open world. And so it's just like even with something like turn-based combat, for example, way cheaper to make a turn-based game than it is to make an action game. And not only would it be cheaper, you would have people applauding you for doing it. And so whenever I look at all these things that they could potentially do, I'm just like, you guys could just go in there and bring all these things back, cut the cost of what you're currently working on, and a lot of people would be cheering you on for doing exactly that. And you would be better off because the profits would be better.
Yeah. I mean, like, I still think the biggest challenge that Square Enix have had is that they just don't iterate anymore. And I think,
Yeah.
going back to the earlier era, they were always iterating on everything. And
Yeah.
so there was a natural progression, even if things were different. They some things were kept the same, some things were
Mm,
put in brand new, and other things were developed upon. And
mm,
like, as much as I want to absolutely go along with what you're saying, I
yeah.
do feel as though it's akin to asking them to figure it out again, even though technically it's what they used to do.
Yeah.
I still think that the smartest choice for them is to just say, okay, what we've done with remake and rebirth is really, really good. Let's just keep cooking on that, and you can like keep the battle system, develop it slightly,
Mm,
um, and I don't know what they're going to do with part three, for example, how they're going to like tweak it and make it slightly different. But
mm,
they showed the golden era, that the ATB system was very malleable based on, they would incorporate slightly new things, like, when Final Fantasy VII incorporated the limit breaks into it. It was a game changer for how dynamic it made everything feel. It made everything much more fast paced and interactive, and it then had the interactive elements too, like, so it was a bit more, there was more feedback in terms of what you were doing with the combat. They found ways to tweak
mm,
what they had already, and that was when they would have slightly different people come in to work on the battle system, knowing that okay, but you still have to keep that formula because Ito's watching you from afar. like, um,
Yeah.
like if they had, I still think it would have been amazing to see if they'd have said, okay, with 16, we want to see what Suzuki can do with Endo's system, right?
That
It's
would have been
like,
incredible. That would have
yeah,
been so incredible. Yeah.
and you'd have like two branches off of the same base, but what can two like different like really talented battle directors do with the same core base? And then you start like with the different lineages, and you have different like identities within it. Um, but yeah, I still think their best chance for success is just building on
Mm.
what Rebirth has done, and I really hope that that's what they do after the remake trilogy is complete. That they just are like, right, we need to turn around like after like if it says it is 2027, like the next game has to be 2030, like at the latest, and from
Yeah.
Hamaguchi's team, right? That's like just keep on with that cadence because they'll have a like core fan base that they've developed through the Seven trilogy, and who knows how many copies that sold. That's who they are directly targeting with this new one, and if they're happy with what they pulled together, then they will be the ones that will absolutely shout out and recommend that game to everyone they know.
Exactly. Exactly. And that is the core issue from like where I personally stand is that currently you have Final Fantasy, which is so divisive in part because they keep doing all these different things to try to hit 10 million and they validate every single one of those things as Final Fantasy. And they have basically created a scenario where no matter what they do, half of people are going to be pissed every single time. Right. And so I do see like a lot of people say, oh, there's nothing that Square Enix can do. I'm like, perhaps now that they've created this scenario, but I don't think that was the case. And then in terms of the very long development times, you know, when you have a game like FF8, even though FF8 wasn't nearly as divisive as it's portrayed to be now, but when you have a game like FF8 that was a bit more divisive than, you know, say FF7, it's okay because the next year you have FF9. It's not a big deal, right? When you have Final Fantasy 16 and it comes out and it's divisive, it's a pretty big deal because we're going to be sitting on Final Fantasy 16 as the latest mainline installment for quite a few number of years. And unless you're counting Final Fantasy 7 Remake Part 3, which in this specific scenario, I really don't because that's not the next mainline title, you know, you're going to be sitting on Final Fantasy 16 probably until 2030. And if you love the game, I guess that's fine. But if it missed for you, then you have to sit on that disconnect from Final Fantasy for that 5 years.
Yeah. And that's
You
the
know?
kind of sad thing about it, right? Because like we know that Hamaguchi's team is completely like rammed with the remake. They have to finish that. But you know, Yoshida was able to work on an MMO and Final Fantasy 16 at the same time. If they were given the same mindset that okay, you've got to take everything you learned from 16 and like fix all the things that people didn't like about it because 16 was so close to being that game. Like
Mm,
there are things that they could have changed to make it what people wanted it to be. And let's say that they were given that mandate, right? You've got 3 years, 3 or 4 years to get out a game that is, let's say it was Final Fantasy 17 or whatever. That game would be coming out next year.
yeah.
like,
Yeah.
well, but it's clearly not going to be coming. I have no idea what Yoshida's working on. Like if he is working on something alongside the MMO, um, but it's clearly, I mean, maybe it's going to come out next year. Who knows? But like that should have been their objective. Like take everything you've learned from 16, fix it, and then make a new game that comes out like three-ish years later.
Yeah.
And that would have been coming out 2026, 2027. Like it seemed based on what Hamaguchi has been able to do, that seems realistic.
Yeah. That seems like the model going forward, I think. So I would like to while we're chatting, is there any chat questions that we have or that anyone would like to submit really fast? Because I always like to take the chat questions at this point. If there's see if there's any out there already. But essentially, yeah, I completely agree. I think that when you look at Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and you look at how fast they were able to put that together, and you look at the Game of the Year nominations, and you look at um, the outpour of love, people saying this is the model for the series going forward, and you look at how it was achieved, which is from them building on what they had, it seems to me that it's very clear about what they need to do. Okay, so we do have some fan questions here. Black Lion Guard asks, semi-personal question for Darryl, if he's up for answering it. I know you've been able to focus more on content creation this year, and you've been pumping out content at an impressive level. I'm curious how you've adapted to the upshift. Has your work process changed? Is your work-life balance better for it? Are you happy with how things are going?
Things have been very interesting this year. I'll say that, and yeah, like it's been really cool to transition to this new, I guess, model of how things are working.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, we've tried to really improve our operation to make sure we can put out content on a more regular basis without there being any kind of diminishment. I think that's the main thing for me. Like I do pay a lot of attention to how what we're doing is being received, and I always want to make sure that what we're doing is as good as it can be. And yeah, this year has definitely been I'd say a positive. Like the Kickstarter campaign was a huge success. I think the channel's had its probably best ever year. And we've obviously launched a new channel as well, and everyone seems to be really digging that. So I think going into 2026, there's a lot of optimism around everything, and like we still got so much more that we want to make as well. It's just not enough time to make it all.
That's awesome. That's awesome. You guys are killing it right now. Clout Stripe First Class over on Twitch as so. Do you guys think that Hamaguchi and that team will be doing FF17 because they are the most, I want to say, stable team right now, as far as we know? My guess is probably yes, and I'll tie this into a question. I don't know how to say your username, Leonless. But you're a regular viewer of mine. They asked, what do you guys think Creative Studio 2 is doing? So to tie those two questions together, I think either Creative Studio 2 or Creative Studio 1 is probably working on Final Fantasy 17. It could be a situation where they are working on Final Fantasy 17 and 18. My understanding and my analysis of it is that I don't think that Creative Studio 3 is working on a mainline title right now. I mean, a mainline offline title. I don't think that it would make sense given the current circumstances for them to be focused on that and to be focused on um, a new number title. So I think that 14 is kind of going through it and they're putting everything they have into 14. They may be working on like new IP or something else, but I think Yoshi P was actually not lying this time when he said that like he's hands off with the next mainline title. What's your estimate, Darryl?
Yeah, it's very interesting to try and figure out what the different creative studios are working on.
Yeah.
I mean, like, yeah, like the fact that Katars is technically the head of Creative Studio 1 and 2, but also the head of 2 is really interesting. Especially because I think the more interesting thing about it is that Toriyama is the deputy head of Creative Studio 2, but clearly he's working on
Mhm.
part 3, you'd think, as the co-director again in terms of the narrative. Um, so far, Creative Studio 2 have only been really involved with Saga games, I think. And I don't think Katara's really got too much skin in the game with the Saga franchise. So you hope to think that you'd like to think that they've figured it out, but then honestly, who knows? Like, and I guess this goes back to the kind of the 3D investment partners asking for more transparency because we don't actually know. It's never been officially announced anywhere who's like what each studio actually stands for, how many studios there even are. Our estimation right now is that there are 7 creative studios, but like Creative Studio 6, for example, I think it is, no one even knows what they are or what they've. I don't think they've like they just we just know there must be a 6 because there's a 7. Like it's like
Oh,
it's
I
it's
think it'd be
it's very
funnier if
it's
there
very
was no
strange.
6, and it's
Yeah,
just like they just like 7, so they were like, "Yo, we're going with 7." That's
but no, I like
crazy.
I would love Square Enix to say like everything around it, like properly share the hierarchies. Like a proper org chart would be nice because
Mm.
there is conflicting information out there. Like obviously, yeah, like it's just revealed somewhere that Kitase is the head of Creative Studio 1 and 2, but then Hamaguchi's the head of Creative Studio 1. So then you have to assume that Kitase is technically running Creative Studio 2 and overseeing Creative Studio 1. It's not overly clear, and it's the same for the other creative studios as well. I mean, like Creative Studio 5 is the only one that's really clear
Mm.
what they stand for. But it didn't. I mean, Hamaguchi said recently that Remake Part 3 is not the only game that he's working on within his studio, right? Like, there's other stuff that they're doing. No idea what any of that is. I'm sure like it's going to be revealed at some point. But as far as we know, Creative Studio 1 has always been mainline Final Fantasy game. Like that's what they've done. The only deviation they had from that was when they worked on Mobius. Like
Yeah.
every other like since it was founded, like all the way back when, even going back into the Square era of like going back to like 91 or something, like that division has always been responsible for a mainline Final Fantasy games. Like
Mm.
it only changed when Business Division 2 worked on 15, um, and then Creative Business Unit 3 worked on 16. But that's only because the other guys are working on remake.
Yeah. So it seems clear to me that I do think that Creative Studio One is working on a Final Fantasy, and whether that's 17 or 18 is probably what remains to be seen. But they're always working on a Final Fantasy. I would like to think that Creative Studio 2 is also going to be kind of like a maybe a splinter off of Creative Studio 1. And then what they'll do is that they'll have 3 mainline Final Fantasy teams going. And so bi-yearly there will be like a brand new Final Fantasy game, and that Final Fantasy
And
game
an
will have been in
expansion,
development. Right,
right?
and
And
an
a quarterly
expansion.
expansion.
Right. So basically, um, yeah, so really in between that, you'll maybe go like 1 year without like a Final Fantasy thing happening, and then actually maybe not even that, because you may have like maybe like a side game that appears in between that, right? So every year you'd have a major Final Fantasy release happening. That's what I think that they need to do.
Yeah, and then like you'd hope that the side game that they release is something of really high quality. So they either figure out how to like pick Asano's brain and get him to teach them how to quality control with outsourcing. Because like I think I made the point in the video, and maybe like you have a different perspective on this, Ryan, but
Mm,
like Octopath 1 and 2 and
mm,
the Dragon Quest remakes and Live Alive and
mm.
even the Adventures of Elliot, they're all worked on by completely different companies, but you can't really tell that, right?
I didn't know that. Yeah, that's crazy. Yeah.
Because they have like such good quality control on like what they want these companies to work on. I think there's like over the
Mm.
past 5 years they've worked with 6 different outsourcing partners.
Wow.
Because like Triangle
That's
Strategy again
really,
was
yeah.
a different company. Like they're all completely different companies. Like they do
Mm.
have like some consistency, but it's not as much as you'd think. Because I was surprised, yeah, that even Adventures of Elliot is being worked on by a different studio. I'm like, how? Like, this is how they can churn all the games out so quickly, though, because they have
Right.
like three different studios working under their guidance every year, which is why they can do three different games, which is crazy.
Because yeah,
Um,
I was wondering how they were outputting so fast, and now that makes sense.
but like, I think if they can figure out how to like use his model, and then you have it like Creative Studio One, they can be working on one game in house, and then they can outsource another game that has a clear vision behind it, because that has
Mm,
always been the struggle, right? Like Stranger of Paradise, I think, is the poster boy for it. That it I, I don't really know what the plan was for that game, but it clearly wasn't at the quality bar that Square wanted it to be. And you all you have to do is look at the other Team Ninja games that they were produced by that kind of division. That Stranger of Paradise is nowhere near on the same quality bar as Rise of the Ronin and Wolong and Neo. Like it's not, because but then that's ultimately Square's responsibility, Square Enix's responsibility, not Team
hmm.
Ninja's. They
Yeah.
just made the game they were asked to make.
You know, and it's just it is crazy too with games like that where it just really felt like in terms of creating the like really making sure that was a quality product. I hate to say it, but like it really doesn't feel like anyone was doing that in general. It really just feels like they just got the game back from them and was just like, yeah, we'll publish it. And
They'll
no
do.
one was like, no one. I don't even think. I mean, people clearly no one was even checking the models because if you did, you would find out that the models had like an absurdly high poly count, and they had to go in and because nowadays you have tools that can help you like reduce the poly count of models. But like if you did, you'd realize that the bat enemies in Stranger of Paradise have about as many polygons as the Cloud Strife Final Fantasy VII Remake model.
Which is
I'm not kidding.
mental.
Yeah, that's how poorly optimized that game was. So I was like, no one even bothered to check the models. I'm like, any experienced game developer would look at that and be like, oh, this is horrendous. The game is going to run terrible. And like, nobody did anything.
But I think that game is like one of the epitomes of what we were talking about,
Yeah.
right? Imagine if they'd have
Yeah.
made a Souls-ish uh, a game at
Yeah.
the quality of like a world class, like Neo. Like Neo is or Lies of P, right? Like
Yeah.
any of like the kind of like the pretenders behind the Souls franchise that are considered like, because I think
Hmm.
Neo is typically a 90 plus rated game. Like it's got a really hardcore fan base, and there are conceptually things that are similar between Neo and Stranger of Paradise for sure. But it's just nowhere near the same level of quality. But imagine if it was. Imagine if
Yeah.
they'd have actually like made a game that was as good as it could have been. Because like Lies of P right now is like, everyone loves that game. It's kind of considered to be the best non From Soft Souls game, right?
Hmm.
And
Yeah.
it's got a really good like sales long tail. Everyone loves the DLC expansion. Um, but Stranger Paradise was not that.
Yeah. Yeah. And I get people liking the game that it is, but I'm just like, yeah, but it
Imagine the
just
game it
could.
could have been.
Yeah, the game that it could have been, though, if they actually like had put something into it. Let's. Is there one last question that we have to like end things off on that would be really interesting? How about this one? Pretty interesting. Thoughts on a brand new Final Fantasy MMO anytime soon?
I, MMOs are a really strange one, right? I
Mm,
knew you and I occasionally talk about World of Warcraft, like from afar, and
yeah.
how like that game is somehow still like they've managed to like bring it around, and part of what they did to bring it around was to to bring back what people liked about the original game. So they've got two continuities now, haven't they? Because they did World of
Mm,
Warcraft Classic.
yeah.
I feel as though, again, if you're trying to be efficient around it, like Final Fantasy 11 Classic would be a really great thing for them to do, because what they turned the game into is very different from what people remember it being, and that could bring back a whole load of subscribers. And also, like, I know you started playing it more recently, but you're probably really curious about what it actually was like
Mm-hmm.
back when it was originally out. And
Yeah.
you know, that's how they've managed to, like, World of Warcraft is still going, I the launch of new MMOs is such a hard thing now. It's like a kind of a weird genre, isn't it? Like, there's very few that even have paid subscriptions now outside of, I think, 14 and World of Warcraft.
Yeah.
I think they're like
It
10 and
really
11.
is kind of just those two for the most part now.
And
Like
11 is still
everything
going.
else is, yeah, everything else is like,
Actually, Dragon Quest 10 is still going too, but
right. But
yeah.
they're very niche. I would say that like the only two like largely like mainstream MMOs that are like being played globally probably are 14 and that. And there's probably like a ton of South Korean MMOs and Chinese MMOs that I have no idea about that do have a ton of subscribers, but like it does kind of feel like the MMOs as a genre um outside of 14 and World of Warcraft is kind of a dying genre, which is funny because we have the technology now to make MMOs work better than ever before. You know, we have better internet and better GPUs. It's amazing that we had FF11 running on PlayStation 2. So I don't know if they're going to be making another Final Fantasy MMO. Obviously, I think that it is always something that they're constantly considering, right? So I think it's possible that they have like design documents and prototypes and tests of like what they think Final Fantasy Online 3, let's say, would be. I don't think that it's fleshed out into any concept that they plan on